participation, how much people vote. As a matter of fact, we are 26 out of around 35 in the OECD, so near the bottom of the list in terms of voter participation. Not a great showing for the beacon of democracy in the world. There is a little bit of good news, though. Some subgroups in the United States are already at the moonshot. So families and households earning more than $150,000 a year, they're already at 80%, so they don't need our help. The bad news is that's only about 10 to 15% of the American population, and everyone else votes substantially less. Low-income folks vote at less than 50%, and so that's not too good. Another piece of good news is that some states in the United States are very close to the moonshot, so we know that this is possible. Minnesota, in 2016, 75% of folks voted, so they only have 5% to go. And a number of states, voting is very, very high, but in the majority of states, we're pretty far from the moonshot. Now, how can we get to full participation? We need a lot of creative energy here. And there's all sorts of ways to split this up. I think about it in 3 different buckets. There are policy things that we can do, there are cultural things that we can do, and there are organizational things that we can do. There's lots of public policy ideas. We'll discuss some of those tonight about how to get to 80%, how to really boost participation rates. Lots of public policy ideas. I think there's less energy in the other 2 buckets. The first is, their second bucket is civic culture. How can we create a culture in which everyone votes, feels like it's their responsibility to vote? We're kind of rubbing sticks together here, but we're starting by creating these t-shirts. That's one way. There are many others. Part of the current civic culture, I think, is pretty hostile to voting. Ronald Reagan, many years ago, said government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. I think that doesn't make people super enthusiastic about participating in the political process. I once sponsored a design contest to get people to think of the best bumper sticker to advertise government is good. Nobody had any very good designs, so I kind of gave that up. Maybe make government good is a better slogan. Maybe we get the government we deserve. Scratch your heads. I don't know how to create this civic culture, but until we create a stronger civic culture of participation, we're not going to really get to 80%, I don't believe. Now, organizational commitment. One of the reasons I'm really excited about about Harvard Votes and the HKS Challenge is that a lot of people feel like electoral participation is up to government or the political parties. But imagine a world in which every organization really thought it was its civic responsibility to get people to vote, in which every university sought to register all of its students, every company sought to register all of its employees and all of its customers. We are actually not the first to do a student voting challenge. The first, as far as I know, was the University of Michigan last year, which committed to created the Big Ten Challenge, and the Ford School is committed to registering 90% of its students to vote. We're trying to get all public policy schools, and then hopefully many, many universities to commit to this. Some ideas here. Patagonia actually gives all of its employees Tuesday off so that they can go vote and go register to vote. So they've actually created a corporate holiday on Tuesday. Lyft, I'm told, is giving everybody 50% off rides on Election Tuesday, so go take a Lyft to vote on Tuesday. So this is a spur to ask what you can do to increase voting, both very locally here on campus in Cambridge and Massachusetts, but all over the United States. And tonight we have a great panel all of Kennedy School colleagues, all faculty members at the Kennedy School, to explore this question of what we can do to get everyone to vote, and then what would happen if we did. First is my good friend Alex Keyssar. Alex is the Matthew W. Stirling Professor of History and Social Policy. He's perhaps the leading historian of American democracy in the United States, and has also written on labor and technology. His book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, was named the best book in U.S. history by the American Historical Association and the Historical Society, and it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's currently finishing a book on the Electoral College titled, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? I'm sure many people still entertain that question. You should read his book when it comes up. He's also a frequent contributor and signatory to amicus briefs in cases on the law of democracy including the recent Wisconsin redistricting case, Gill versus Whitford. Kathryn Sikkink is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights and Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's a scholar of human rights, international social movements, transnational advocacy networks, and international institutions. She's written many books, including most recently, The Justice Cascade, How Human Rights Prosecutions Are Changing World Politics, and a seminal book on how social movements break through to succeed on issues like labor rights, environmental protection, and human rights, titled Activists Beyond Borders. She's a fellow of the American Philosophical Society and the American Association for Arts and Sciences and the Council on Foreign Relations. Cornell William Brooks is a professor of practice of public leadership and social justice. Before coming to the Kennedy School, he was president and CEO of the NAACP. Cornell led the NAACP to the early edge of many social rights struggles, including pressing against racial discrimination and police discrimination in Ferguson and the fight for environmental justice in Flint, Michigan. He was arrested in 2017 at a sit-in protest against Jeff Sessions' nomination to Attorney General, and Cornell was the first public leader to call for the removal of the Confederate flag after the Dylann Roof mass murder of the Charleston Nine in South Carolina. He is a graduate of Jackson State College and received a Master of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology and has led many social justice organizations before the NAACP. So welcome to our panel. So we'll go through a few questions before opening it up for a group discussion. The first question goes to Alex to get a look back before we look at the present and forward. So Alex, right now people in the United States don't vote very much compared to other countries. Is there some deeply American defect that dooms us to democratic underperformance? Has it always been this way? Are there times when we've been closer to full participation?
The answer is no. There is not some inbred historical defect. Do we have that graph?
Yeah,
that, yeah. If you look at that graph, which simplifies a whole lot of things, what it tells you is that in fact low turnout in American elections is a 20th century phenomenon. The moonshot 80% figure was consistently achieved from the 1850s into the 1890s, and then, as you can see, turnout plummets. It bobs up a couple of times, but it stays at a low plateau. So the question is, why? I mean, did everyone just suddenly get inoculations that said don't vote? Of course, the story's complicated, but I like the simple version, which is that what happened is that there's a peak in voting around in the 1890s. And what happens after that, the first step that happens after that, and it's not just something that happened, was that third parties get driven out of American political life. The period from the mid-19th century until the 1890s is a period of flourishing third parties. Some of you may dimly remember that the Republican Party was a third party in the 1850s. The big party at the end of the century was the Populist Party, which elected mayors, representatives in lots of places around the country. But there were lots of other parties too. The towns in Massachusetts where you now live, towns like Brockton, Lynn, and a number of others, all had socialist mayors and socialist city councils during this period. What happens in the 1890s is, in effect, the two parties collude to pass a set of rules that make it much more difficult for third parties to get on the ballot. Okay, it wasn't an accident. They wanted to get rid of these third parties, especially the populists. In the wake of that, turnout starts to plummet. They also engage in various voter suppression actions, obviously in the South, which are enormous, but also in the North against immigrant workers. So they're suppressing poor workers, and they're kind of dividing the country up geographically. So you have a one-party South and something of a one-party Republican North, at least in parts of the North. This creates a period in which I think what happens there, and it goes back to the question of policy and culture, is that This creates a period of uncompetitive elections and very few choices for people, and people believing that really nothing that happened much was going to do anything for them, and that spawns among the less well off a culture of non-participation, which we have struggled to change ever since. And we can talk a little bit, so if people have questions, or I'll say a little bit later about some of the blips and what the consequences were. But our low turnout was, in a sense, the creation of our party system.
Wow, that's great. Thank you very much. Kathryn, you spent a lot of your professional career thinking about human rights and struggles to protect rights generally. I had the pleasure of reading a chapter of your manuscript, and in that manuscript you write that many activists and scholars have focused more on rights than responsibilities, and you're seeking to change the balance a little bit. You say that responsibilities are really important in areas like human rights and democracy. Why do you think we have a responsibility to participate in democracy? And do you think that Americans, especially the younger Americans that you've been talking to on this campus and elsewhere, feel that responsibility?
Well, so I've worked on human rights for a long time, and I realize that a lot of human rights activists have a deep sense of personal responsibility, but they feel sometimes we shouldn't talk about responsibility. Right? We should live it but not talk about it, because if we talk about responsibility, it might sound like preaching, it might sound even like blaming the victim. Okay? But the closer I looked at voting, and especially voting in this country, I realized that all these things we say, the importance of a civic culture, the importance of policy rules, matter, but it also matters that we think that not just that we have a right to vote, but that we have a responsibility to vote. And not just that we have a responsibility to vote, but that we have a responsibility to encourage others to vote. So why would that be? Well, one argument I want to make to you is that voter suppression is a conscious and collective and well-orchestrated set of policies. Okay, it's not an accident. Voter suppression is happening not just because state governments, okay, but also because a lot of other parts of our society are working to suppress votes. So if we're laissez-faire about our responsibilities to vote and our responsibilities to encourage others to vote, we're saying, no, we're not really fighting back appropriately against voter suppression. And what people sometimes don't know is that students are one of the big subjects of voter suppression. Sometimes you students are suppressed because states are trying to suppress other voters, and you get caught up in it, right? So they're trying to suppress blacks, low incomes, immigrants by voter registration laws, and those same voter ID identification laws, and those same rigid voter identification laws are affecting students. Right? Because you too may not have a voter ID that has your address on it where you are going to vote. Okay, but sometimes actually there's real voter suppression of students, right? And so we see that there are a number of states, dozens of states, that now will either not allow a student ID as a government issue ID, or they have residency requirements like bring in your gas bill. Well, if you live in a student dormitory, a house, that's not going to work. You don't have a gas bill to bring in. So one argument I make is because voter suppression is conscious and well-orchestrated, we have to find a well-orchestrated response. And that response can not only be the government needs to do this, the parties need to do that, but we ourselves don't have a responsibility as well. Of course, the government needs to do a lot. Of course, political parties have a big responsibility. But the voting problem in our country is a structural injustice, and all of us connected to that structural injustice and able to act need to take action.
Thank you. So following up on the voter suppression theme, Cornell, in your work at the NAACP and at other organizations, you've done many, many things to fight against voter suppression efforts. This panel and this broader effort of the moonshot takes a different approach. And my thought is that even if we could somehow wave a wand and get rid of all of the voter suppression, all of the IDs, even felon disenfranchisement, we'd boost the voting rate a little bit. It's really important to do, but we'd boost it a little bit, maybe 3%, maybe 5%, I don't know. But it wouldn't get us near 80%. How does, in your mind, combating voter suppression relate to efforts to increase the vote to get to 80%, such as automatic voter registration? Is it a matter of picking battles and rights come first, or how do you think about it?
Sure. So if we think about our country from the inception of the Constitution in 1787, or the 15th Amendment, or the Voting Rights Act, what we have here is a long, sad saga of suppressing votes, voter dilution, voter denial, over and over again, where we see subtlety and complexity as the co-conspirators of racial oppression, systemic racism, oppression based upon gender and national origin, and certainly generation. So then, when we think about this sad tale, we have to decide among ourselves, how can we create a different narrative with a different ending? And I'll just give you an example. My grandfather, Reverend James Edmund Prelo, ran for Congress in 1946 in the wake of a Supreme Court decision called Smith versus Allwright, which held that the all-white Southern Democratic primary was unconstitutional. That is to say, excluding African Americans from the Democratic Party or the primary process as a means of keeping them out of a one-party system violated the Constitution. When Thurgood Marshall won that case, my grandfather was inspired to run for Congress. But it took decades upon end for James Clyburn to win the same seat. So he ran in 1946. James Clyburn did not win that seat until decades later. So that means that there's a story for you as activists, as students, to tell, which is to say we have to get beyond using strategies like the Voting Rights Act only, changes in civic culture only, automatic voting only. We have to begin to think about universal voting. How do we create an affirmative duty by the government to get people out to vote? So in other words, it's not merely about eliminating barriers. So when we think about our Constitution, we have the 15th Amendment barring discrimination based upon race or barring discrimination based upon age. But there's no affirmative right to vote. So we've got to go beyond establishing the minimum to create the civic maximum. That's where we have to go next. And so when I think about my grandfather and I think about you, we've got to go beyond simply eliminating barriers to actually creating an architecture of inclusion as opposed to a civic architecture of exclusion.
That's great. Thank you. Alex, so there were many moments in American history where people who didn't participate very much all of a sudden participated more. Sometimes they got to participate more because of a permission. Sometimes it was because they wanted to participate more because of a movement or opportunities. Low-income people, socially excluded minorities, women, working people. What difference do you think these new people coming into the electorate and actively engaging make to public policy, if any?
Well, I answer that both historically and in terms of the contemporary practice of politics. Historically, I assume you all have memorized that graph that we had up before and you remember where all the turning points are. But the fact is that the 1890s, which is this high point, the 1880s and 1890s, can we get the graph?
It's up there.
Okay.
It's actually not on the conference.
This is the period when you get the first regulation of monopolies in business now. This is the Interstate Commerce Commission. And this is when antitrust laws are passed. And even in the continuing effects of that, it's really when you get the formation of a regulatory state, or you get things like workmen's compensation laws passed just after the turn of the century. In the New Deal, when you get a surge upwards in voting in the 1934 elections and in the 1936 elections, it has an impact. That's when you get Social Security, which is unemployment insurance as well as old age insurance. That's when you get the National Labor Relations Act, which protects the right to organize of workers. The upsurge in the 1960s is linked to Johnson's Great Society program. So the historical pattern is fairly clear, but there's also a mechanism, a contemporary mechanism to reflect on, which I think really brings home the relationship between turnout and policy. Many of you may have worked on campaigns. When campaigns are devising their strategies, when they're trying to decide what issues to promote, they do a lot of polling, right? These guys get rich doing this. Well, who do they poll? They don't poll everybody. They poll people who are considered to be likely voters. Mm-hmm. If you voted last time or the last couple of times, you're a likely voter. So those are the people whose policy preferences or policy concerns are factored in to the sort of programs and campaigns. If you're not a likely voter, you don't get factored in. Just imagine if we got to 80%, what that would do to the kinds of issues and the kinds of campaigns that would have to be run in this country. We also know, by the way, that there's a broad pattern that the higher the level of turnout, the more policies are redistributive.
That's great. You know, on the point about opinion polling, there's a fantastic fellow in the democracy program here this semester named Laura Quinn, and she's the founder of Catalyst, which is the Democratic Party's list organization. And she has a very succinct way of describing the logic of how microtargeting works now that reinforces is actually a deeper form of the polling issue that you pointed to. So both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party using lots and lots of data now for microtargeting. And in her view, and she really knows because she does this, right? It's an efficiency game. So you take the people that you know are going to turn out, and you figure out what they're like, and then you expand one little circle out based on how many dollars you have, and then one more, and then one more. And so basically you're forming the electorate that turns out that's as close as possible to the electorate that you already know about. And so there's no exploration of what people who aren't already participating very highly think and want. And it's kind of, so it just doubles down on your polling issue. Kathryn, you're, among other things, a scholar of comparative politics. Looking around the world at other countries other than the United States, are there particular democratic experiences or practices or policies or institutions that we ought to learn from if we want to get more people to participate?
Okay. So first, before I talk about the comparative part, I want to talk about the comparative in the U.S. part because I'm from
you're from Minnesota.
I'm from the state of Minnesota, so we're the leading.
Almost at 80.
And so first we should say that we really know a lot of things about how to increase voter turnout in this country. You know, you have same-day registration, which in Minnesota, you know, you don't have these identification requirements, and you do what Archon talked about, you have a civic culture, right? And I think it's important that we not only focus on the institutional or the procedural issues, but we point to the part of civic culture. Because I would actually say, aside from, you know, same-day registration and not having, that the most notable thing in Minnesota is actually the civic culture about people feeling like voting is what you do. You know, and you grow up being taught that, you know, people, we vote, we're voters. You know,
you're right.
You see the T-shirt? Okay, the T-shirt, voter. So civic culture is really important. In terms of international examples, I want to talk about the example of Brazil. It's one that Alex knows well. So there are 22 countries in the world that have compulsory voting, okay? I'm not sure we could have it in this country, but I want to tell you a few things about it because I think it's interesting. The first is that in Brazil, there's compulsory voting, and so you have to get a stamp when you vote, okay? You go into a voting machine, and if you want to have a protest vote, you have two options. And aside from your voting options, you have two protest options. One is I refuse to vote, and one is I vote in blank. Okay? So I like that idea that in this country, we sometimes have the notion that we protest by not voting, right? But no one knows if you're protesting by not voting. Well, we don't know if it's a protest vote. We don't know if, you're being suppressed. We don't know if you're lazy. I mean, so there's no way that you can register your protest in this country by not voting. But in Brazil, you can register it 2 ways. And, one can register a protest at the polls. You can write in any candidate. So I think if people want to protest, they should go and vote to protest. But also, it's a holiday in Brazil. That's something we can emulate, right? Even if it's hard to emulate compulsory vote in this country, we could have it. Should be a holiday. And may I recommend that it be Columbus, that we get rid of Columbus Day and we make it a holiday. I'm just reminded of this because I'm reminded that we celebrate Columbus Day still at Harvard University, which I think is a big mistake. And we could use that federal holiday and we could make voting a holiday. And in Brazil also, there is actually no alcohol. Did you know that? This is a country where people actually like to drink.
The opposite of 19th century.
They like to drink,
right.
but from the night before until the polls close, there's no alcohol. And I'm not actually advocating no alcohol. What I'm saying is Brazil shows that if a country's serious about voting, they do things to show they're serious. In this country, we're capable of showing we're serious about things like our very draconian drug policy. We're capable of being draconian, but we can't be deeply enthusiastic and supportive of voting.
That's a great point.
But I wanted to just say one more thing, because you asked me about students in the first question. I forgot to answer. I've been doing focus groups with Harvard undergraduate students at houses, and I'm going to continue to do a few more this fall. And what I learned, actually, is that many Harvard students perceive voting as complicated and difficult. Which surprised me, because you guys, this is the smartest group of students
if
in
the Harvard
whole
undergrad
country.
perceives it as
if
difficult.
the Harvard undergrad perceives it as difficult and complicated, students everywhere and people everywhere see it as difficult and complicated. So this is yet another reason why we have to help one another, why we have to see that it's not only a right but a responsibility. And yes, not only responsibility of governments, but a responsibility of all of us. We also know that that the best thing to mobilize voters is a person they know, and especially a peer, right? So the best person to get your fellow students to the poll is another student, is a friend. Political parties can call till they're blue in the face, robocalls and things like that, but nothing's more effective than peer pressure on voting. And peer pressure, not bad peer pressure, not shaming, like fun peer pressure, like this is important. Let's do this together. Let's make it fun. Let's get our friends together to do it. So I think those would be recommendations that could make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. So I don't know how we'd actually prove this, but you've told me this. Other comparative has told me this, that they think in the United States it's harder to vote than in any other, kind of reasonable democratic country, which is a remarkable thing if it's true. It's probably true. So that's kind of one observation. And then on your second, this fact that it's really hard to vote in the United States, just the hoops and the complications. There are many ways to attack that problem, right? One is a public policy answer. You could try to create a universal ID for everyone and federalize all elections. I think that would be some time before that's accomplished. You could try to organize some peer-to-peer and mutual aid, and people help people out. As a matter of the civic culture and boosting participation. Or you could try innovation. So what we're asking everyone to do as part of this Harvard Votes Challenge is register on TurboVote. And TurboVote is a startup that was started by 2 Kennedy School alums a few years ago, Seth Flaxman and Katie Peters. And it's an online platform, and you sign up for it. And the purpose of TurboVote is to reduce the friction and make it easier for you to vote. So it will walk you through the registration process. It will send you a mail-in or absentee ballot if you're eligible for that. It'll remind you of when elections are, right? So just like, it's a point about like creative approaches to solving this important problem. Cornell, among the panelists, you are perhaps the closest student of civil rights struggles. So you're in a great position to address the second part of this evening's question. What would happen if everyone did vote in the United States? As a result of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States, many African Americans gained the ability to vote, especially in the South. How do you think that enfranchisement helped the black community, if at all? Maybe you don't think it helped very much. There's certainly much to be done. What would change today if almost half of the electorate that doesn't participate started voting, do you think?
So all we need to do is look at, and Alex knows this all too well, look at history in terms of the past as a window into the present and the future. So if we think about the period of Reconstruction in South Carolina, North Carolina, in the Deep South, when African Americans gained access to the franchise and literally put their bodies and their ballots behind public education, put their bodies and their ballots behind laws to give people more of an access to the wealth that they created, right? So if we think about where we are in the midst of this era of mass incarceration, what we've seen, for example, in Philadelphia, in terms of an increase in voter turnout, African Americans and other citizens getting behind the election of a DA who's standing against mass incarceration. And so what this would mean is if you can imagine young people, the gap between older people and younger people being eliminated in terms of registration and voter turnout, you would see different policies with respect to student loans and student debt. You would see different policies with respect to investing in the next generation. You would see different policies with respect to women. It would represent a seismic shift in this country. Think about it, adding 6 million people to the rolls who are effectively invisible, in the Ralph Ellison sense of the word, who are behind bars that we don't consider, right? And so this would, I think, will represent a fundamental shift, not only in terms of the policies we have, but also the way our public interest organizations operate. Yeah. And so in other words, when you think about it this way, when you have organizations who had, literally, when I was the head of the NAACP, we had to dedicate massive resources to prevent people from having their votes denied or diluted. Fewer resources to actually educating voters. And this is also a life and death commitment. Here's what I mean. You think about Jimmy Lee Jackson having lost his life to secure the right to vote. When we think about Jonathan Daniels, who was a young seminarian at Episcopal Divinity School, who literally gave his life to vote. Viola Liuzzo, who gave her life to secure the right to vote. And only 3 years ago, a friend of mine who walked with me and a group of NAACP marchers from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., 1,002 miles over the course of 40 days against voter suppression, Middle Passage died 900 miles into that march. And so here's my point. It would change our democracy in terms of the kinds of issues that are represented in terms of public policy. It would literally save lives, I believe. I believe it would fundamentally change what our civic apparatus looks like. In other words, we could focus on educating voters instead of ensuring that they weren't discriminated against.
That's a good point.
And last point here, it would change the kind of people and number of people willing to run for office, right? Because if more people vote, more people consider that they have an opportunity to serve, because you can appeal to a broad representative group of people instead of those who skew wealthy, skew white, skew privilege, and skew non-student.
That's great. Lightning round, last question. Same question for everyone. If you could make a single change to public policy, to organizational commitment, to civic culture, to really increase voter turnout to get close to 80%, what would it be?
Well, my pie in the sky response might be mandatory voting, and
that's good. That's
no,
good.
No, but that's not my real response. Forgive me. But I can't resist a historical story about mandatory voting. Again, if you all remember that graph, the turnout starts going down. At that point, respectable citizens start getting really worried about turnout in the United States, and they start saying, "Wow, turnout's going down. we have to get all of our good middle-class people to vote. The only people that are voting are these, these immigrants in the machines in the city. So let's maybe think about mandatory voting. Massachusetts has a constitutional provision passed to enable mandatory voting in the 19-teens. Then about 10 years later, there were the first social scientific studies of turnout. And what they discovered was that it was the opposite, that in fact middle-class people were voting and poor people were not. And at that point, those people said, never mind about mandatory voting, okay? It's a remarkable story. But the somewhat more realistic change that I would recommend, and I echo Kathryn here, is that I would move voting to a holiday or even Sunday, which for some reason the last time that suggestion was put forward was decided that it would be deeply irreligious, although many countries in the world do it. But my reason for saying that is not only that I think it would increase turnout in itself, but it would transform the culture of election day into something with or without alcohol that would be celebratory and a gathering. I mean, I have been in other countries on Elections Day, and that's what it feels like. You want to get a small sample of this, and I will be sort of disowned for having said this, but go to Somerville High School on October 8th. They changed location. Okay, it's Brazilian Election Day, in fact, and there will be a location where Brazilians will be voting here in Boston on October 8th, and it's like a party that will be going on. Whereas for us, the way elections work in the United States, it's something you squeeze in before or after work. And there's no sense of public ritual except watching the damn television after the polls close.
And being grumpy and standing in line.
Right.
Waiting to get to the front. Kathryn, one change.
So I already talked about a number of changes. So let me say that we can do all these policy changes, and we should, but we also need a norm change. Okay? And we have shown in this country that massive norm changes can take place. Used to be that everyone smoked and no one cared, and no one buckled their kids in. I mean, I remember no one buckled their children in seatbelts, and we see that we can move from 0 buckling your children in seatbelts to 100 buckling your children in seatbelts because there's been a norm shift. It becomes simply what we must do. It becomes that have you ever nowadays, you don't buckle yourself in, much less your children, and you start getting like shaky, like you can't, or you can't, like it makes you nervous. So we don't have a norm shift around voting, okay, because we don't have this sense of the norm to vote. And I wonder why that is, because it's not just that it's hard. These other norm shifts have been hard. How hard is it for as many people to give up cigarettes? That's addictive.
Right.
We're talking people gave up addictive practices to stop smoking. Whatever voting is, however hard it is, it's not giving up an addiction to do it. And so how do we make norm shifts? Well, you need norm entrepreneurs. We know that. You need conscious policies. It needs to be bottom up, not just top down. You need a groundswell of activity, and I think that's what we need in this voting area, is civic culture and a norm shift and a commitment to what it takes to change the way we think about voting.
That's great. Thank you. Cornell.
So, I would agree with both Kathryn and Alex in terms of compulsory or universal voting. But fundamentally, what I like to see is voting seen not as your grandmother's civic responsibility, but radical, insurrectionist, disruptive democracy activity today. Meaning, when you think about Laquan McDonald having his life taken in Chicago by a police officer, and a group of young people deciding we're going to unelect a district attorney and succeeding. The point being here is we've got to recast voting. Voting is not something you do because you have to. It's something you do because certainly it's a responsibility but it is also a form of protest activity. It's a form of disruptive activity. It's a way of upending the civic order. We have seen this over and over in the context of history, not just back then, but now. And so fundamentally, it means shifting the norms. It means connecting protests and the polls in a lot tighter, neater fashion than we've seen. And certainly, in my work at the NAACP, we tried to do that. In other words, register people to vote and protest, get arrested and vote, disrupt someone's office and vote.
That's great. Thank you very much. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and a little discussion. For those of you who've been, there are 4 microphones, if you could form lines behind the microphones. And for those of you who haven't been to the forum before, there are 3 rules. First of all, you should say who you are. Second, every question ends with a question mark, so no statements. And then the third rule is 1 per customer. 1 question only, please. Yes, right here.
My name is Ryan Davis, and I'm a senior at the college.
Oh, great.
So Professor Keyssar mentioned the intersection of policy and voting, and my question is with regards to the intersection of emotion and voting. So Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report says, by far and away, the most galvanizing force to voting is fear or anger. If you strip away a lot of the top OECD countries like Belgium, Switzerland, or Australia who have compulsory voting, and you look at other examples of people without that who got high participation rates, you can look at Weimar Germany, which was hyper-politicized. You could look at 1850 to 1900 for the United States, which you could argue was a very tenuous time between the North and the South. There was a civil war, Reconstruction. You can see another jump in this, World War II with voting, and then a slight increase during the 60s with the Vietnam War. So my question is, given that the goal is a moonshot to 80% voting, is it possible to get this quick increase without using fear and anger? Can you do it with the change in civic culture and the positive rhetoric that we are striving for?
Anybody want to jump in? That's a good question.
I mean, well, look, we have fear.
Plenty of fear.
It's not like that. But I'm not sure I fully accept the premise. I mean, there's also hope as a reason to take action. I mean, and in some ways you may have, hope and fear in combination. Can we do it in the short run? Probably not. But what we're watching this fall, and again, we'll see how it all plays out when we see the election results, but we're seeing mobilizations in local races, of a sort, of different sort, and not quite the same people that we haven't seen before. Now, I think that is predicated in part upon fear about the current administration, but I think that also as these races have gone on, a kind of hopefulness that, well, if they can do it in the Bronx or Queens, and if they can do it in Boston, maybe, it can happen. So I think that both are part of the story.
Yep. Right.
Let me just note this, that fear is like a spark plug. Hope is gas. Fear gets you started. Hope keeps you going. And fear, I should say, fear as a political motivator presumes a sense of civic agency. That is to say, we're angry, and we assume voting is the means by which to express that anger. Where people don't feel that voting is the means by which they can express that anger, or they're literally structurally barred from voting, anger doesn't work by itself.
Thank you.
Up here? Yes, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Kira Hall. I'm a freshman in college from Prentice, Mississippi.
Wow.
Thank you for being here with us today. So you guys talked about voter suppression. Many opponents of the electoral colleges believe that they don't accurately represent the national popular vote and that they directly decrease voter turnout. Do you believe that the abolishment of electoral colleges would directly combat voter suppression?
I guess this is me.
Yeah, it's all you.
Let me take. There were actually a couple of pieces of your question. I think that the Electoral College really does suppress turnout Because the fact is, in most presidential election years now, there are only about 10 or 11 states that are called battleground states or swing states where the campaign is ever really going on. And nobody's paying attention to the other states, and it doesn't matter. I mean, whether I vote or not in Massachusetts is not going to have an impact, and I know that. And that's true for people living in terms of the outcome in 38 states because of the Electoral College and because of winner take all. So I think that if you got rid of the Electoral College, you would see significant increases in turnout in presidential election. I don't see that structural change as reducing the impulse on some people's part to suppress voters. It might even increase it. Right. I think that, that's going to be a separate issue to be fought, and we can deal with both of them at the same time.
Very good.
Yeah.
Up here.
Hello, my name is Harpreet Singh. I'm also first year here at the college from Mississippi. Currently, Vermont and Maine are the only two states in which felons retain the right to vote even during incarceration. In 21 other states, felons lose their right to vote while they are incarcerated and for a period of time after they have been released. In order to regain their voting rights, outstanding fees or in some cases a pardon from the governor is required to once again be eligible to vote. That being said, my question to you all is, what are your opinions on current voting constraints placed on former felons, and what changes can be made to improve the process for those released from prison, which in turn would increase the voter base?
Short answer, there's just no rational moral basis for felony disenfranchisement, period, right? So when I was president of the NAACP, I would get letters from prisoners in Maine because they had the largest NAACP chapter behind bars because they could vote and because they were engaged. Okay?
Wow.
I didn't get letters from those of you from Mississippi from Parchment because you couldn't vote behind bars. In Maine, if I'm not mistaken, when the governor runs for, or I should say, when candidates run for governor, they've actually had gubernatorial debates behind the walls of a prison. And so we need to be very clear about this. Felony disenfranchisement is really about disenfranchising communities of color. Point, period, paragraph. And if we could add 6 million folks to the rolls by getting rid of it overnight, this would be all to the good for the whole of the republic, and certainly for everyone who has anyone in prison, doesn't know anybody in prison, or who's never been to a prison. This would benefit the whole of the country.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I work at Harvard University. I think what was interesting to me about this conversation tonight was more of the what would happen if everyone voted, and so I thought it was a really interesting example of Brazil, that everybody votes there, but then what happens, I mean, I think many of us here know that Brazil's got some pretty corrupt politics. So if you could talk a little bit more about what would happen if everybody voted, what responsibilities you would have then to make sure everybody's educated. Because my understanding now is that the people who come out to vote are people who are probably more educated than the average person who would vote if everybody voted. What responsibilities would we have to make sure everybody is educated if everybody is voting rather? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about the example of Brazil and how that compares to our politics and what pitfalls exist there.
For Kathryn.
Well, first I'd say that, if we look at Brazil since it re-democratized in the mid-'80s, there's been a lot of really interesting and progressive political developments, as you know. And they led, as we know, we had a former metal worker as the president of Brazil, that there were some very dramatic social policy changes, okay? And so I wouldn't discount Brazil so quickly just because there's some current political problems going on there right now, okay? And I wouldn't use as an example for why we shouldn't try to get more people voting. But I take your point that it's not enough just to get people to vote. And the problem is we have such low voter turnout here that we are just focusing on trying to get people to the polls, and there's a much bigger issue here. But one reason I think student turnout is so important. One is it's low. Student turnout is lower than young people turnout, young people 18 to 29, and young people turnout is lower than older people turnout. And so with students, we say, here we have a group of people who are well-informed and have an option to be well-informed. They're surrounded in an information atmosphere, right, and so I think there's a really, really strong argument right now that if we could get more students to vote, that it would be a high-quality vote and would make a real contribution.
Yeah. If I could
please.
Come on, I keep alluding to these very distant times, but in the late 19th century, there was a lot of there was a whole current of thinking, well, you expanded the franchise, you got rid of all these other restrictions, but what about education? Are poor, less educated people, do we want them, voting or not? And what became the admirable solution, it wasn't always carried, fulfilled later, was no, what we need to do is educate them, not prevent them from voting, right? But educate them. In fact, the New York State Constitution, to this day, has a provision requiring its public schools to provide an education adequate for people in New York to perform the duties of citizenship, meaning voting and jury duty. And actually, that provision has been the basis of a number of very successful lawsuits to provide money to poor school districts. So I think, yes, it's getting turnout way up isn't going to solve everything, but then we'll try to solve those problems.
So these are some data that I just kind of pulled together last week, and it addresses Cornell's point about who would actually run, and then Kathryn's point about Lula being a steel worker. And so on the first column is the percentage of the American population that is in these general categories, and the second column is the percentage of members of Congress, all 538, House and Senate, who are members of those categories. So veterans are overrepresented, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, a little bit underrepresented, women, so substantially underrepresented. But the thing that kind of blows you away is people who don't have college degrees and people whose last job was as a laborer, right? So 66% of Americans don't have college degrees, like contrary to what Princeton and Harvard undergraduates think. A lot of America didn't graduate from college, right? A third of people over 25 have college degrees. 4% of Congress lacks a college degree. It's incredible. And then 2% of Congress are people whose last job before going into politics, they're not like Lula, right? Was being a laborer. So I'm just, data don't, you need to think more about what that means, whether that's a good or bad thing, but it is striking. Like if you're upset about women being underrepresented or African Americans or Asians being underrepresented, the extent of these other demographic kinds of underrepresentation is far, far greater. Yes.
Hi, my name is Uzma, and I'm a grad student at the Ed School and a local social sciences teacher as well. So my question is, I moved here from Texas about a year ago, and one of the biggest things I noticed was that there seems to be a greater interest in local elections here than where I came from. And actually, I noticed that Texas kind of sat at the bottom of the data that you showed in terms of voter turnout. So my question is, should this norm shift start at the grassroots level? Should we kind of focus on pumping up excitement and interest in local elections before we look at the midterms and the presidential elections?
Can I?
Yes.
So I would say that we have an excessive focus on presidential elections. And so even, the point about the Electoral College, but yes, it's a big problem, but it's a big problem for presidential elections. And it doesn't have an effect, of course, on our midterms and our municipal elections. And so many students, and again, when I did these focus groups, feel like my voice doesn't count. But actually, they meant my voice doesn't count in a presidential election every 4 years. Instead of saying, but my voice might count in the midterms, and my voice might really count in a municipal election. Can I tell one quick story?
Yes.
And it's Steve Walt, and I have his permission to tell this story. So Professor Steve Walt here his wife Betsy is very involved in local elections. One time she told him, she goes, "Don't forget to vote in the municipal elections." And she had some candidates she really advised him to support. He drove home, got in the thing, realized he'd forgotten. He rushed to the polls. He voted. One of her candidates won by one vote. One vote. In other words, Steve's vote carried the day of a city councilor in Brookline. Okay, so local elections, your vote does count. It can really count more than any place else. But I think right now, it's hard to get a lot of people interested in the Cambridge City Council and school board, you know. But these midterms are really exciting right now. There are amazing things happening in our country around these midterms, and we need to generate excitement. Only 24% of eligible Harvard students voted in the last midterm election, 2014. And we need to really increase that number because there are so many exciting races here and around the country.
That's great. Yeah. Yes, up here.
Hi, my name is Harpreet Singh. I'm a second-year MPA student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking discussion. I'm from Toronto, and in Canada we have an affirmative right to vote in our Constitution. We have voting in our prison.
Whoops, we've just lost you.
Hello? We have...
Shout, maybe.
So we have voting within our correctional facilities. We have same-day voting. You don't need any ID. You can sign an affidavit, and they'll give you a ballot, and you can vote. And after all of that, our turnout is pretty much the same, in the low 60s. And when we look at that list of countries that were the highest, Sweden, Belgium, Denmark, the big difference there is they all had proportional electoral systems where it wasn't the winner-take-all model that we use in Canada or the US. And is there a role for that kind of a shift in electoral system in order to raise turnout?
I mean, certainly, basically first past the post or winner. Like winner take all. I mean, it discourages turnout because each extra vote that you get for your side will not necessarily matter, whereas in a proportional system it will. So I think you're absolutely right. The design of the electoral system can have a big impact on turnout, and alas, our electoral system seems to possess most of the features that would discourage turnout.
As if it were designed.
But if I could just add to that, because we're not going to switch into a proportional representation system in this country, but there are reforms we can make, including ranked voting, which we use now in Cambridge, that can have a similar effect. And so we should look to reforms that are possible. Also in Minneapolis we had ranked voting, that are possible that could dramatically improve.
And Maine just adopted it.
Yeah. So I think that let's look more closely at how ranked voting could affect maybe in Canada as well.
Right. So the point being there's a lot of potential public policy short of full-on PR that might encourage greater competition and participation and having your vote counted. You get the last question.
I just wanted your guys...
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm Jenna. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question is, I wanted to hear your opinions on Turkey's voter turnout this past summer, reaching approximately 87%. I wanted to know your thoughts.
You just got back from...
I just returned from Turkey 2 days ago. And what I can say is Turkey is no longer a democracy. That's not my personal opinion. That's Freedom House, which calls it not free. Okay? And so it makes a really important point, and that is elections alone do not make democracy. You have to have a free and fair playing field, which did not exist in Turkey. There was no, basically the opposition political parties had virtually no access to media, and the government had complete control of the media. Okay? So once again, voter turnout is only one piece of this. We also need to have competitive elections with a fair playing field, and we need to have the basic rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, which also do not exist right now in Turkey. There are 5,500 academics who have been dismissed from their jobs for something like just signing a petition for peace. So it really is simply, it's a elected authoritarian government that manages to get a high voter turnout, but not a democracy.
Thank you very much. Any closing thoughts from the panelists?
I would close with a quotation from one of my non-heroes, Mitch McConnell, who famously said that low turnout is a sign of a contented electorate, which if you look at, say, the breakdowns by income, would suggest that poor Americans are much more contented than wealthy Americans. I mean, we have to prove him wrong.
I would say that on this issue that voting is complicated, right, and that students and others feel it's hard, that it's important that everyone try to convert themselves. People in this room, are, exactly because you came and you care about this, are people who could become resource people for your friends, your community, and so I urge you to, we're going to have another event here on it's called Voter 101, but it's really about how people can become resource people in their houses or in their places of work to help others vote, encourage and help others to vote.
Sure. I just would like to close on the point of hope, meaning that there's often not an empirical case for hope, but rather hope is a moral choice. And so when we look at the history of voting in this country, we've seen people who've literally given everything to secure the right to vote. But I also know that around the country, when we look at automatic voting, when we look at efforts to enfranchise those who have lost the right to vote because they are behind bars or have a criminal record, we see change. We see an unprecedented level of activism around the country among people your age. That is an empirical reason to hope. That's something you can see. It is measurable, it is quantifiable, but ultimately it is predictive of the possibilities that lie before us.
That's great. So we've gained an enormous insight into both parts of the question for this evening, both what would it take to get everyone to participate, and then what would happen. I think what I got out of this that I didn't quite expect, that I understand more clearly now, that came out in all three of your remarks, is that both individually and collectively and institutionally, we have to express more commitment to the democracy by making voting and participation special in all of these ways. It's not something that, you throw open the door and kind of take it for granted. No, there's all of these affirmative things you need to do to show as an individual and as a society that this is really important. And we've got to start doing those things, and we've got to figure out what additional ways to express that passion and that sentiment for democracy are. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.